Albuquerque. Today, it's a little bit overcast, but it's still warm, and we have the atmosphere set, and I don't think that there's going to be any shouting from the balconies. So, where I left off yesterday, Socrates has made it into the house of Agathon, Symposium. He has declared that he knows, quote, I'll quote it, speaking for myself, he said, I couldn't well dissent when I claimed that love is the one thing in the world that I understand. So he, and I sort of contrasted his assertion and his confidence about his understanding of love with his well-known repeated mantra, all I know is that I know nothing at all. So we're going to pick it up right from there, that the symposium is underway in the house of Agathon, and here we go. There are two aspects of Socrates' speech that are striking. First is the fact that he is delivering a speech, and thereby departing from his unusual inquisitive style of dialogue. The intimate gathering may have influenced a softening of Socrates' somewhat harsh dismissal of speech-making, which he derided, for example, when he met Protagoras, the great sophist, and upon hearing his speech on virtue, quote, gazed at him spellbound, eager to catch any further word that he might utter. Then I said, Socrates, I am a forgetful sort of man, Protagoras, and if someone speaks at length, I lose the thread of the argument. And that's from the Protagoras 32d, 34, 328d, 334d. On the occasion of Agathon's banquet, Socrates seems to have embraced the magical character of speech and spurned the dialectic. Although, if truth be told, the speech is hardly a monologue, but actually a recollection of a dialogue he had had years before. And this relates to the second unusual aspect, that the speech is not so much an original piece of oration, but a recollection of a teaching. What Socrates offers is to share a gift he had received years before from, quote, a woman called Diotima, a woman who was deeply versed in this and many other fields of knowledge. It was she who taught me the philosophy of love, and now I am going to try to connect her teaching as I can without her help. Symposium 201d. Taken together, these two aspects present us with a unique portrait of Socrates and a distinct version of the legend of his mission. Through his recollection of his encounter with Diotima, we learn that Socrates was put on his way by a certain clarity concerning love, a spirit that is neither human nor mortal, but exists somewhere in between wisdom and ignorance, and is a messenger, one who delivers tidings, one of the, quote, envoys and interpreters that ply between heaven and earth, flying upward with our worship and our prayers, and descending with the heavenly answers and commandments. They form the medium of the prophetic arts, of sacrifice, initiation, and incantation, of divination and of sorcery. For the divine will not mingle directly with the human, and it is only through the mediation of the spirit world that man can have any intercourse, whether waking or sleeping, with the gods. And the man who is versed in such matters is said to have spiritual powers, as opposed to the mechanical powers of the man who is an expert in the more mundane arts. There are many spirits and many kinds of spirits too, and love is one of them. That's Symposium 203a. Those who receive love's teaching receive the message from the messenger, the tidings that connect the human and mortal, the ignorant and the wise. Diotima reveals to Socrates that these tidings offer a promise to those who receive them openly. To receive them openly, one must be already turned away from the comings and goings of everyday life, the idle chatter of commerce, and released to the wave of the tide. Quote, and turning his eyes toward the open sea of beauty, he will find in such contemplation the seed of the most fruitful discourse and the loftiest thought, and reap a golden harvest of philosophy, until confirmed and strengthened, he will come upon one single form of knowledge, the knowledge of the beauty I am about to speak of. Symposium 210D. And that's how I ended that short and sweet meditation. And so, once again, I'm commenting on sort of the visceral or feeling I have after reading it. And I feel as if at this point, when I was writing these meditations, I was so much locked into the Symposium and Socrates' presence at Agathon's house, and going back to the rereading of the prologue of from Bonaventure, which is the epigram for the experiment, that there is a slow pace that I was taking. Right? So in the Bonaventure quotation, I talk of the need to move it slowly and at a slow pace, slow and steady sort of pace. And so what I'm doing with the writing, I think, is sort of doing that, right? And taking my time to be very careful to talk about each of these kind of signature moments in the Symposium. So I started 2 days ago with the discussion of how the Symposium is put together, and it's being a recollection of a recollection. Then I spoke of Socrates, now that we've gotten through the part of it, the Symposium being a memory of Socrates' movement into the dialogue, and his stopping at the porch, this kind of liminal space, and that liminal space becomes something that he, as he enters into the Symposium, into Agathon's house, that liminal space becomes a metaphor for what he calls his shadowy understanding, or his understanding as shadowy at best, which is to say that his thinking, the thinking of the philosopher, and where he was ontologically and existentially, was in the depths of that darkness, of that shadow, being drawn into the porch. He was in that space, and he didn't do it as a kind of performance, of course. I mean, the whole point is that Socrates was taken into this. He was drawn into this place, and that's very important. I have to underline that in terms of emphasizing the sense in which, at least for my interest, that all along the relationship between being and learning happens when there is this desubjectification, and the thinker is pulled, gravitationally, in a sense, pulled into the dwelling of thinking, into the modality of thinking. So that evocative speech, which is a conveying of the news or of the tidings of this place, is the prompt for that, so to speak. But once prompted, once turned towards that, it's the full force of being's presencing that sort of draws us into thinking. And so it wasn't a decision, and it wasn't a matter of Socrates performing or willing himself into this place. He was taken right there, and he allowed himself to go. So if anything, it was a willing of non-willing, right? This is Galassinite. And so then today, finally, he sat down, and now we hear something of his speech. And what's noteworthy here, and I sort of begin by saying that what's striking is that he's making a speech, and if you go through many of the dialogues, this is the one of the questions that's raised by Socrates, and that Plato is offering up to us through his writing of the Socratic dialogues, is the problem of language and the way that language works, right? And so the concern, and this is something I've been talking to my colleagues about here at the Philosophy of Education Society, is that philosophy has always been in a place of trying to define itself, right? It's never been a matter that's settled. It's never been a settled discourse. I think this is a sort of misunderstanding of the tradition of philosophy. And at this time in particular, this is what's so significant about the Symposium. It's not simply that they're talking about love, It's how they're talking about love. What is the state in which they're talking about love? I mean, you have drunken poets or people that are hungover. You have all these styles, right? Even within the dramatic arts, you have different styles of speaking. And philosophy then becomes a way of speaking. It becomes a distinct way of offering up the narrative on love. And so, but this is part of the thing that Plato's laying out. He's sort of obviously weighing it to the side of philosophy, but he's saying, you know, this is one form, one way. And so, what's interesting, though, is that in this particular piece of work, the Symposium, you have Socrates making a speech. And so you have the introduction of the philosophical speech. And why this is interesting is because if you followed along the dialogues, you know, you have Socrates saying what makes philosophy different, and this is what I think Heidegger was emphasizing and what Arendt emphasizes, is that it's not monological, it's dialogical. Right? And so Socrates in the Protagoras, which is named after the great rhetorician Protagoras, he dismisses Protagoras, and he's quite rude, right? And so when they're having this discussion, you know, and they're having a dialogue in Protagoras, Protagoras gets impatient with Socrates, and then Socrates says, okay, well, how do you want to have this thing happen, this conversation? And Protagoras says, well, I think we should just both of us give, you know, our take on it, give papers, if you will, or give a speech, and then we'll discuss what, you know, the other has said. Socrates kind of sighs, like, okay, go ahead. So Protagoras gives this long, you know, presentation, long speech, you know, and rhetorically it's quite brilliant. And then Socrates kind of rudely sort of says, well, I'm sorry, I drifted off there. I have a really hard time following people when they go on and on and on. Now, that may be true, actually, right? I mean, you may be finding it hard to follow me as I go on and on and on. And then there's a sense in which humans, as Aristotle said, you know, we're political animals, which means to say that we like to interact. We don't like to just be passively listening and having to pay attention, although we've been socialized to get better at that through various media. But the point is that Socrates is emphasizing, listen, philosophy is this back and forth, it's a conversation, it's this quick exchange, it's improvisational. It's directed by the interaction. It's not just one person, you know, holding court for whatever, 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes and then having other people listen and then responding. So what's interesting about the Symposium, though, is that they each take their turns at making a speech, and Socrates is like, yeah, I'm going to make a speech. So that's what's striking about him. But, of course, he doesn't make a speech. He recounts a story, and his story is about a dialogue that he had with Diotima. And this is what makes it an interesting thing. So it's a recollection. I've made the point that the Symposium really is organized and formed around memory, the power of memory and recollection, recalling. And further, that the recollection is one of a dialogue, right? But it's hardly a dialogue, because in fact, Diotima offers Socrates a teaching. So she actually offers him up a story, a very strong story, a didactic tale of the story of love, and that's what he relates to them. So what's key here is that he's not himself making a speech. He's telling a story, or rather, he's offering up a message or delivering, retelling a story that was told to him. So it's a sort of double narrative that's going on. And what finally is very interesting and very, I think, significant and beautiful is the actual language that he uses here, where he says, you know, Diotima, a woman deeply versed in this and many other fields of knowledge. This is key. It's also key to my point I've been making at this conference that, you know, philosophy has always been interdisciplinary since its beginning. It was she who taught me the philosophy of love, and now I'm going to try to connect her teaching as I can without her help. And then he gives this very interesting rendering of what she told him, and it's this strange, peculiar depiction of the art of philosophy, which he calls the prophetic arts. Now, this is very interesting because it's here where the sense of what I call Socrates 3.0, here's evidence, right, for that. Now, that's something that I haven't talked about, and it's really part of my more recent work. But, you know, when we read the lines of the Phaedo that I said already were so central for me in my work, where Socrates is doing this writing, and he's talking about now having come back to the, the voice of this muse or this figure in his dream that's telling him to practice art and to make music. And when he comes back to this and he says, well, maybe I should have been doing it in a different way, and maybe this way was writing lyrical poetry, lyrics, and doing a sort of poetic thing, I read that as saying, this is Socrates prophesizing, if you will, a philosophy to come, and sort of audaciously I'm saying that's what we sort of have to pick up. So in this speech, though, that he gives, in this retelling of a tale, he really calls this particular art that takes up the philosophy of love a prophetic art. And he says, the arts of sacrifice, initiation, incantation, of divination, of sorcery. How does the divine enter into our world? The man who is well versed in such matters is said to have spiritual powers, to be empowered by the spiritual, as opposed to the mechanical powers of the person who is an expert in the more mundane arts. So this opens up a whole conversation, I think, that's really important for me in terms of what philosophy is doing, what it can be doing, or just quite simply the tradition, the Socratic, Platonic tradition, mostly Socratic, I want to argue, that's conveyed through Plato, that understands philosophy as a particular kind of art, and that the relationship between being and learning is mediated by this art, and that this art has a very clear tradition, that goes back well before the Greeks. And this is something that's very important. This is something that goes back to Egypt, actually, and it goes back to the Pythagoras, and so Pythagoras, as having gone to Egypt and having traveled in the temples and having learned the relationship between mathematics and the study of the soul and all these things, he conveys this a generation later, actually, to Plato, who kind of studies, he visits one of the Pythagorean colonies, and so this tradition of this art of philosophy as a kind of prophetic art, or what I sometimes call prognostication, this is something that's in a way a lost art, right? And this lost art is quite significant for us to take up if we want to recover the tradition of philosophy as an art, specifically as an art that is tied to what's called music, musike, or even what we would call soulful education. So if we're talking in the contemporary about philosophy as an art of music, as an art of music making, and then we start to talk about Socrates 3.0 and the music making practice of the music making philosophy, I think this is yet another example of where we would go, another point of entry into that conversation. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that and pick it up again tomorrow.